Good afternoon or good morning whenever you're listening to this. My name is Russell Swanson, and this is a brief review of my lecture on the debate over utilitarianism. In my last lecture, I built upon a structure of a lecture given in the writings of James Rachel's American philosopher that I pull from strongly in this lecture series. But I built some of my own ideas into this and some of my own twist on it. And I started off, though, as he did in his original writings on the debate over utilitarianism, by sort of trying to boil down the position of utilitarianism to three basic claims. My version of that goes as follows, that number one, when you're trying to understand utilitarianism, only positive and negative experiences on the part of creatures like ourselves that can have positive and negative experiences are sentient in that regard. Only positive and negative experiences give rise to the very notions of good and bad in existence. So number one, only positive and negative experiences give rise to the evaluations of good and bad in existence. Number two, only foreseeable consequences are used in determining morally right actions from morally wrong actions. And number three, each person counts for one, or slightly more radically stated, each sentient being counts. And then what I did after developing a little bit for each one of those basic claims of utilitarian perspective on morality, I began to address one by one a series of criticisms that have been offered against the theory historically, counterexamples. We talked about the challenges against the claim that only a positive and negative experience matters. And we looked at counterexamples involving, a musician that lost her ability to play her music. We also talked about a counterexample involving a backstabber, and how if you didn't know that the backstabbing was happening, then you wouldn't have any negative experience. So we seem forced to conclude that nothing bad is happening there. And the main strategy on the part of the utilitarian is to defend his or her theoretical perspective, number one, by challenging these counterexamples. And so, we need to remind ourselves that we're looking at foreseeable consequences in order to determine right and wrong, and that seems relevant to this criticism of the idea that only positive and negative experiences impact good and bad. In the case of the backstabbing friend, for example, if we can put friend in scare quotes there, what we'll see is that it's foreseeable that you're going to find out, and even if you don't find out, there could be some pain caused by the backstabbing should it go on for any length of time in terms of the way that it hurts your relationships. And this is somehow, I think, going to allow us to account from a utilitarian perspective for how, yes, it's still negative experiences that give rise to sort of the badness, and in this case, the wrongness of the action that's being discussed in that counterexample, that proposed counterexample. We went on to discuss more significant challenges for utilitarianism, namely attacks on this basic idea that only foreseeable consequences matter when determining right from wrong. And we hear critics raise issues like, what about justice? What about rights? What about obligations? What are sometimes called backward-looking reasons. And there we saw that the utilitarian has kind of two strategies for defending his or her theoretical perspective. One, we challenge the examples that are used to draw out our intuitions about justice, rights, and obligations. But secondly, we do a little bit more sophisticated work by talking about how it's also conceivable that we would use something like the principle of utility. And just to remind you, that the Mill's idea that actions are right in proportion to their tendency to promote happiness and wrong in proportion to their tendency to promote unhappiness. And we use a standard like that, the standard implied by the principle of utility, to not evaluate specific actions, but maybe to generate some general rules to live by. And this produces a position called rule utilitarianism. And then I've suggested in my lecture that maybe we could just have a kind of a last rule. Whatever the rules are, there'll always be a last rule that would be a rule about exceptions to the general rules in order to deal with some of the more sophisticated objections that utilitarians themselves often have against this idea of rule utilitarianism. But again, to summarize the move here, the critic, raises some case like the case of Miss York in the 1950s, and how she had her rights violated, and shows how it's problematic for the utilitarian to be wanting to weigh the suffering of Miss York against the happiness of her abusers. Let's just keep it simple like that today. And how, considering the happiness of the abusers of Miss York seems wrong-headed, morally speaking. And again, the utilitarian can push back a little bit and say, yeah, sure, I'm willing to bite the bullet here and weigh the happiness of these abusers against the great suffering of Miss York and all the people who found out about this and have this anxiety now about this abuse. But furthermore, you're using something like rights to beat up on utilitarianism because you claim that utilitarianism doesn't account for rights. Well, rule utilitarianism could. We could use the principle of utility to justify the very idea of rights, which are, from a modern crisis in ethics perspective, a bit mysterious to appeal to in and of themselves. You can use science to study the human being as long as you want. You're going to understand the eyeballs and the hair and all kinds of things, and toes and bones and hearts. But where are you going to discover their natural rights? And so from a modern perspective, or what Bentham actually says, rights are nonsense on stilts. They're a fiction that are raised up. And why are they raised up? Well, they're raised up because they are actually still an important idea. And why? Because of the utility of the idea, because of the way that rights, when we act as if we have these things called natural rights, we have a better chance at happiness in society and the greatest happiness for the greatest number. And so the move on the part of the utilitarian, I called in my lecture philosophical jiu-jitsu, is to take the strength of the attack on the part of the critic, which is to use rights to attack the theory, and say, actually, you need my theory or something like it, maybe a social contract theory, or you need my theory like utilitarianism or the principle of utility to justify your idea of rights. Right? And sort of reverses the position using the strength of the idea of rights sort of back against the critic to bolster the case for some theoretical framework like utilitarianism. And so, all of the examples about justice, rights, and obligations in the lecture had that same structure. And then lastly, we looked at attacks on this idea that each individual human being counts equally from a moral perspective, and even the more radical claim that each sentient being should count morally. Admitting that that's going to muddy the calculus and the weighing, because it's tough to know how to weigh different species in terms of their moral value. Some people would say it should be equal. Others would say there should be some kind of spectrum. Again, that's a difficult matter to explore, but let's go with the intuitive idea that, most of us get it. Torturing any kind of other non-human sentient animal just seems wrong. And so the utilitarians put forth this idea that all sentient beings should be included in the scope of our moral concern. But the critic comes back and says, well, your theory is just unrealistic in how much it expects of us. Because if we take seriously that every human counts equally and that each sentient being counts somehow in the overall calculus, it's going to be incredibly disruptive to the way we live our personal lives. It's going to call into questions decisions like spending extra money on your child's education or on your child's birthday. It's going to call into question spending extra money on a nicer TV or a nicer car. It's going to call into questions, the meatloaf that you have for dinner and the family barbecue, because there is meat being barbecued there. And the response of the utilitarian here is a little bit more direct, and it's characterized, I think, by J.J.C. Smart in 1961 as just, maybe it's common sense that should be questioned and not the attempted moral theoretical structure that's hoping to give us a little bit more conscientious way of thinking about morals. We should bite the bullet here and just admit that some of our practices with regard to our treatment about other non-human animals are morally suspect in serious ways, and we're going to have to interrogate that, as disruptive as that will be. We're also going to have to interrogate the patterns of consumption that we engage in when we're relatively fortunate in life. When we have our basic needs met and we're on to just spending monies on our luxuries or on the things that we want, you know, I'm not one of those that thinks that maybe we need to be too condemnatory of the middle class lifestyle. I think maybe we need to make it more environmentally sustainable, perhaps. But really, certainly by the time you get to that place of owning, your second yacht or your fourth vacation home, certainly the utilitarian is going to say there's not a supererogatory duty here. There is a moral duty here to consider how you could redistribute that wealth that you will never be able to spend in your lifetime. It's not adding anything in some sense to your own life. You have a moral obligation to consider how you might redistribute that wealth in such a way that would make a significant impact on the reduction of pain and suffering for other humans and perhaps other species as well. And so the defense against the charge that it's too demanding and that disrupts our personal experiences is an answer that is really just sort of like, well, tough. I'm sorry you don't like it for that reason, but maybe it's common sense that should be questioned instead of this theory. We may eventually, decades from now, look back on our patterns of consumption and on our factory farming practices and just think that that was just a really, really morally unfortunate time. In the same way that we look back on the tragedy of institutionalized sexism and institutionalized racism, we may look back on our hedonistic consumerism and on our sort of blatant speciesism as a period in which we just hadn't evolved as far as we had hoped at that time. And so, utilitarianism, for all its problems and promises, I think always does serve the purpose of providing us with a provocative critique, allowing us to kind of get to our ultimate goal here in this lecture series, which is a more thoughtful, well-considered approach to the moral positions that we take, and perhaps an opportunity to familiarize ourselves with a framework that may make our moral discourse more productive. And so this completes my review of my lecture on the debate over utilitarianism.